The camera was still rolling when Lieutenant Victor Hayes grabbed Emma Carter by the arm and shoved her against the hallway wall. She didn't scream, she didn't cry. She just looked at him, steady, quiet, like she'd seen worse. And somehow, that made him angrier. "You're done here," he snarled, loud enough for every nurse and orderly in the corridor to hear. "Security will escort you out." Emma said nothing. 48 seconds later, the windows rattled. Then came the sound, low, mechanical, unmistakable, rotors cutting through the afternoon sky directly above Northbridge Regional Hospital. Everyone looked up, nobody moved, and Lieutenant Victor Hayes had no idea his career had just ended. If this story already has you on the edge of your seat, follow along, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Let's go. The morning had started the way most of Emma Carter's mornings did. Badly. She'd slept 3 hours, maybe less, after a double shift that bled into a graveyard rotation nobody else wanted to cover. Her coffee was cold by the time she reached the ER locker room, and her replacement scrubs were one size too large because the supply closet at Northbridge Regional was always running short on mediums. She knotted the drawstring twice, grabbed her badge, and told herself she'd get through the next 12 hours the same way she got through every other shift, one patient at a time. Northbridge Regional Hospital sat at the edge of Stonehaven, a mid-sized city in the industrial Northeast where the winters were brutal, and the city budget was always 3 decisions away from disaster. The hospital itself was functional rather than impressive. 12 floors of concrete and glass, an emergency department that handled everything from cardiac events to gunshot wounds, and a nursing staff that was perpetually understaffed, perpetually exhausted, and perpetually told to do more with less. Emma had been working there for 4 years. She was 29. She held certifications in trauma nursing, advanced cardiac life support, and mass casualty triage. She never talked about any of it unless she had to. Most of her colleagues liked her. Some found her too quiet. The charge nurse, Darlene Kovach, 53 and sharp as a scalpel, had told her once, "You've got this thing, Carter, where you look like you're listening to something nobody else can hear." Emma had said, "I'm usually calculating." Darlene hadn't asked calculating what. The first patient of the day came in at 6:41 a.m., a construction worker with a fractured wrist and a concussion from a scaffold collapse. Emma triaged him, ordered imaging, started the paperwork. The second was a diabetic in her 70s with dangerously low blood sugar and a daughter who wouldn't stop demanding a private room. Emma handled both simultaneously, the way she always handled everything. No wasted motion, no wasted words. By 9 o'clock, the ER was running at 80% capacity. By 10, it was at 95. That was when the ambulance brought in the man with no ID. The paramedics called him a John Doe, but something about the handoff felt off to Emma from the moment the gurney came through the bay doors. The lead medic, young guy, nervous energy, kept glancing toward the ambulance bay like he expected someone to be following him. Gave a report that was technically complete but emotionally hollow, like he'd been coached on what to say and was being careful not to say anything more. The patient was male, mid-40s, lean and muscular in a way that wasn't gym-built, but work-built. His clothes were wrong, civilian on the surface, but the boots were military surplus, the kind that didn't wear the same as regular footwear. 3 lacerations on his torso, one of them deep enough that Emma's eyes went straight to it. Blunt force trauma to the left shoulder, and a wound pattern just below his right scapula that didn't match any story the paramedics had offered. "How'd he present?" Emma asked, already pulling on gloves. "Found in an alley off Mercer," the medic said. "Anonymous call." Emma nodded slowly. She looked at the wound again. "These are entry and exit channels," she said, not loudly, more to herself. "This isn't a fall." "We documented what we observed," the medic said, and then he was gone, walking fast back toward the bay doors before Emma could ask anything else. She didn't have time to chase him. The man's blood pressure was dropping. "Get me a second IV line," she told the ER tech beside her. "And page Dr. Asher, tell him I need him in Bay 3 now. This patient is bleeding internally." The tech moved. Emma moved. The room reorganized itself around the patient the way an emergency department does when someone who knows what she's doing takes charge. His name wasn't in any system, no wallet, no phone, Nothing in his pockets except a single piece of folded paper that Emma hadn't had time to examine. She set it on the equipment tray, focused on the man, and began working. He was in bad shape. Not unsurvivable bad. Not yet, but the kind of bad where the next 20 minutes would determine the next 20 years. Internal hemorrhage, she was almost certain of it. She needed imaging, she needed blood, and she needed Dr. Asher to stop doing whatever he was doing and get here. She was 45 seconds into the secondary assessment when the doors at the end of the corridor swung open. Lieutenant Victor Hayes walked like a man who had never once in his life been told to slow down. He was SPD, Stonehaven Police Department, and he wore his lieutenant's bars the way some men wore jewelry, as proof of something. He was broad-shouldered, mid-50s, with a face that had the particular hardness that comes from years of being right about everything. Behind him came two uniformed officers and a man in a civilian suit who Emma didn't recognize. She'd seen Hayes before. Everyone at Northbridge had. He showed up at the ER 3 or 4 times a year, usually when a suspect in SPD custody needed medical clearance, and he had a habit of treating the hospital like a precinct annex. His rules, his timeline, his call. The nursing staff had filed 2 informal complaints about him. Neither had gone anywhere. He stopped at the nurses' station and spoke to the desk coordinator, Janelle, without looking at her. "I need access to your current intake. I have a person of interest who was brought in this morning. Name's going to be listed as a John Doe." Janelle, 24 years old and 6 months into the job, looked at him and then looked helplessly toward Emma. Emma was still working on her patient. She registered Hayes' presence, noted his tone, and kept her hands where they were. "Sir, our charge nurse handles intake inquiries," Janelle said carefully. "I'm not talking to a charge nurse," Hayes said. "I'm talking to whoever can give me access to a patient right now." Emma looked up. "That patient is in active treatment. He can't be accessed." Hayes turned his head. He looked at her the way men like him look at people they've already categorized. "And you are?" "Emma Carter. I'm the primary nurse on this case." "Okay, Emma." He said her name like it was a small thing, expendable. "I need 5 minutes with this individual. You can step out. He'll still be here when you come back." Emma set down the instrument she was holding. She didn't raise her voice. "This patient is hemorrhaging. If I step out, he may not be here when I come back." Hayes looked at the man on the gurney, then back at Emma. "He's breathing. He's conscious enough. 5 minutes. He is not stable enough for questioning, Lieutenant. And if he's a subject in a police matter, you'll need to go through hospital administration and legal counsel before you can have any access." The civilian in the suit behind Hayes made a small sound. Impatience, maybe irritation, and Hayes shifted his weight forward. "I'm not asking for legal counsel," Hayes said. "I'm asking for 5 minutes. Do you understand the difference between a request from law enforcement and whatever it is you think you're doing right now?" "I understand the difference between lawful medical authority and pressure," Emma said. "And right now, what you're doing is pressure." She turned back to her patient. She heard Hayes tell one of his officers something under his breath. She didn't catch the words, but she caught the tone, and she knew what was coming before it came. Dr. Marcus Asher arrived 6 minutes later, moving fast, reading the tablet Emma had sent to his station. He was 41, competent, and fundamentally decent, which at Northbridge sometimes felt like a liability. He looked at Emma's notes, looked at the patient, and said, "Okay, get me an ultrasound, and I want a surgical consult on standby." "Already paged," Emma said. Asher glanced toward the corridor where Hayes was now standing at the nurse's station making a phone call. "What's happening out there?" "SPD lieutenant is claiming the patient is a person of interest, wants access." Asher exhaled. "He'll need to go through legal. That's what I told him." "And?" Emma just looked at him. Asher said, "I'll go talk to him." The conversation lasted approximately 4 minutes, and Emma could see pieces of it through the bay window. Asher keeping his posture neutral, Hayes doing all the talking, the civilian in the suit occasionally leaning in to add something. At one point, Hayes pointed directly at Emma. Asher shook his head. Hayes pointed again. Then Asher came back in and his face was different. "Administration is getting involved," he said quietly. "Hayes apparently has a relationship with someone on the board." "Pemberton." Emma knew the name. "Richard Pemberton, Director of Hospital Operations." The man who had approved the last 2 rounds of staffing cuts and who had, twice in the last year, personally intervened to smooth over situations involving SPD. "They're asking us to allow a brief access," Asher said, "with medical supervision present." Emma looked at her patient. His pressure was still dropping. She'd just run the ultrasound herself. There was fluid in the abdominal cavity. He needed surgery, not conversation. "He goes to surgery in the next 30 minutes or he doesn't make it," she said. "That's not a position. That's a fact." "I know," Asher said. "Then we can't allow access. Emma, Marcus." She almost never used his first name at work. He stopped. "This patient has injuries consistent with a high-velocity penetrating wound. His hemodynamic status is deteriorating. If we allow anyone into that room for any reason that delays surgical intervention and he dies, that's on us. That's malpractice. And more than that, it's just wrong." Asher was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll go back and tell him." He went. Emma turned to her patient and kept working. She didn't see Hayes speak to Pemberton directly. She only knew it had happened because 12 minutes later, Richard Pemberton himself appeared in the ER bay, pink-cheeked, agitated, wearing the expression of a man who had been interrupted doing something more important. "Ms. Carter," he said. "Not Nurse Carter. Mr. Pemberton. I need you to allow Lieutenant Hayes a supervised visit with the patient in Bay 3. I've explained to Dr. Asher and to Lieutenant Hayes why that's not clinically possible right now." "I'm not asking for your clinical analysis," Pemberton said. "I'm giving you a directive." Emma straightened. "A directive to deny emergency medical care to a patient in hemodynamic decline. A directive to cooperate with law enforcement in a matter that's above your pay grade." Somewhere in the corridor, one of the orderlies had gone very still. Janelle at the desk had her eyes down, staring at her screen, not moving. "With respect," Emma said, "the decision about this patient's care is not above my pay grade. It's exactly my pay grade. And my clinical judgment is that he cannot be disturbed." Pemberton's jaw tightened. "I'll have someone else take over. Dr. Asher is the attending. You'd need to go through him." "Then I'll go through him." He turned. Emma went back to her patient. She could feel the temperature in the room changing the way it does before something breaks. A specific kind of quiet that isn't peace but pressure. The paper she'd set aside earlier caught her eye. She hadn't had a chance to look at it. She picked it up with her free hand, unfolded it one-handed. It was a sequence of numbers. A military format she recognized immediately. But she folded it back and set it down without reacting, because this wasn't the moment, and because whatever this man was, her job right now was to keep him alive. Hayes came back 20 minutes later. He didn't knock, didn't announce. He came into the bay with 2 officers and walked directly to the gurney, and Emma stepped into his path. "Lieutenant, step aside." "I won't." "Ms. Carter, if you do not move, I will have you removed from this floor." Around them, the ER had gone quiet in that way hospitals go quiet when everyone is watching, but no one wants to be seen watching. An orderly in the hallway had stopped pushing a cart. A nurse at the next station had turned 45 degrees. "You can remove me from this floor," Emma said, "but this patient goes to surgery in the next 10 minutes, which means the moment you delay me, whatever happens to him is on your record, not mine." Hayes got closer than he needed to, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath. "Let me explain something to you," he said, voice low and tight. "I've been working this city for 22 years. I have pulled bodies out of buildings that you couldn't imagine, and I have exactly 0 patience for a nurse who thinks her paperwork protects her from the people who actually keep this city safe." Emma looked at him steadily. "My paperwork," she said, "is this patient's chart, and it's going to outlast both of us in whatever investigation comes next." Something shifted in Hayes's face. Not anger, but recognition. Like he'd just processed for the first time that she wasn't flinching. He stepped back. He turned to the officer behind him and said something Emma didn't hear. Then he looked at Pemberton, who had reappeared at the corridor entrance, and something passed between them. A small nod, a decision made. Hayes turned back to Emma. "You're done," he said. "Security is going to escort you out of this department." Emma looked at the patient, then at the monitor showing his vitals, then at Hayes. His pressure is at 82/50, she said. He needs surgery now. Someone else will handle it. Someone else doesn't know what I know about his injuries. That is no longer your problem. He reached out and grabbed her arm. Not gently, not professionally, just grabbed it the way you grab a piece of furniture you're moving out of the way, and turned her toward the corridor. The camera at the corner of Bay 3 was recording. It had been recording all morning. Emma knew this because she'd been the one who'd filed the request to have it installed after a medication dispute the previous year. She didn't look at it. She just let Hayes turn her toward the hall, and she said clearly and calmly, loud enough for the room, "I want it noted for the record that I am being removed from emergency care of a patient in active hemodynamic decline." Hayes shoved her toward the security desk with one hand. Not hard enough to hurt, but hard enough to be seen. "I'll make sure you never work here again," he said. Emma looked at him. "My duty is to the patient who's dying." Then the windows rattled. It started as vibration, the kind you feel in your teeth before you hear it with your ears. The overhead lights flickered once. Then came the sound, rotors, heavy and deliberate, directly above the building. Not one helicopter, two. The ER went completely still. Even Hayes stopped moving. Somewhere above them, on the roof of Northbridge Regional Hospital, something was landing. Janelle stood up from the desk and looked at the ceiling like the answer might be written there. One of Hayes's officers put his hand on his radio. The sound didn't fade. It got louder, then steadied into the particular rhythmic thrum of military aviation holding position. And then, from the main entrance at the far end of the ER corridor, there was a new sound. Boots, fast and synchronized, more than two pairs. And the double doors swung open. 4 men came through, dressed in tactical military gear, weapons holstered but present, moving with the specific kind of efficiency that didn't belong in a hospital. Behind them, a 5th figure sat, tall, composed, wearing the uniform of an Army colonel, name tape and rank visible, hat in hand. They stopped at the nurses' station. Every person in the emergency department was watching. The colonel looked at Janelle. "We're looking for Emma Carter, former combat nurse, Army Medical Corps." The entire ER corridor held its breath. Janelle turned slowly and looked at Emma. Hayes turned too. Every head in the department followed. Emma was still standing exactly where Hayes had shoved her. Slightly off balance from the push, one hand on the wall, security guard beside her with a half-formed grip on her elbow. She hadn't moved. She hadn't needed to. The colonel saw her. He looked at Hayes's hand still near her arm. He looked at the security guard. His expression didn't change exactly, but something in it settled, hardened, the way a decision looks when it's already been made. He walked toward her. His people spread into the corridor behind him, naturally, without being told. Hayes took half a step backward without seeming to realize he'd done it. The colonel stopped 3 feet from Emma. He looked at her. Not the way Hayes had looked at her, not as an obstacle or a subordinate or a problem to be managed, but the way you look at someone you've been trying to find. "Sergeant Carter," he said. And something changed in Emma's face. Not much. A small thing. The kind of change that happens when someone hears a name they haven't heard in a long time. "Colonel Rask," she said. Behind her, Hayes stood completely still for the first time since he'd walked into the building. "The patient in Bay 3, Emma said, her voice low and steady. "He needs surgery. Now. He's been in hemodynamic decline for the last 20 minutes, and every minute I've spent out here is a minute he didn't have." Colonel Rask turned to his team. One word. "Medical." 2 of the soldiers moved immediately toward Bay 3. Rask turned back to Emma. He looked at Hayes. He looked at the security guard, who had quietly let go of Emma's arm and taken 2 steps back. "Who authorized her removal from that patient?" Rask asked. Nobody answered. Hayes's mouth opened. Nothing came out. And Emma Carter walked back into Bay 3, put on fresh gloves, and got to work. The surgery took 41 minutes. Emma knew because she counted. Not obsessively, not the way fear counts, but the way training does. Time in a trauma bay is a resource the same as blood or oxygen, and you account for it the same way, continuously, without sentiment. Dr. Asher had scrubbed in the moment Colonel Rask's medical personnel made clear they weren't surgeons. They were trauma qualified. They could stabilize, but Northbridge's OR was the only option in range, and the clock had already been running too long. Emma handed off primary care at the OR threshold and stood outside the double doors while they wheeled the patient through, watching the back of Asher's head disappear behind the swinging panels. And then she stood very still in the corridor for about 4 seconds before she trusted herself to turn around. The ER below was a different room than the one she'd left 20 minutes ago. Colonel Rask's team had fanned out in a way that wasn't aggressive but was completely unmistakable. 2 soldiers positioned at the main entrance, one at the secondary corridor that led to administration, one at the Bay 3 threshold. Nobody had drawn a weapon, nobody had raised a voice, but the geometry of the room had changed, and every person in it understood what the new geometry meant. Hayes was still there. That surprised her a little. She'd half expected him to leave, to manufacture some call, some obligation, some reason to be elsewhere. But he was standing near the nurses' station with his 2 officers flanking him, and his jaw was doing something complicated, and he was watching Rask the way animals watch something they can't figure out whether to run from. Rask himself was speaking quietly to Janelle, who was nodding with the wide-eyed focus of someone trying very hard to be helpful and professional, while also processing the fact that her shift had gone completely sideways. Emma walked back down. Nobody stopped her. The soldier at the Bay 3 threshold stepped aside without being asked. She wasn't sure if Rask had briefed them on her specifically or if they were simply reading the room. But either way, she was grateful for it because she didn't have the bandwidth right now to explain herself to anyone else. She pulled off her gloves at the station, dropped them in the waste bin, and stood for a moment with her hands braced on the edge of the desk, looking at the vitals readout that was no longer hers to monitor. The numbers were better. Not good. Not yet. But the bleeding had been controlled before the OR, and the surgeon on call was capable, and the patient had been younger and stronger than his injuries looked. She'd done what she could do. Now it was someone else's hands. "Sergeant Carter!" She turned. Rask had crossed the room while she wasn't watching. Up close, he was older than she remembered. The temples had gone fully gray, and there were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 5 years ago, or maybe she just hadn't noticed them then. He looked like someone who had been through several things he hadn't planned on. "Colonel," she said, "walk with me." It wasn't exactly a request. She walked with him. He led her to the family consultation room at the end of the ER corridors, or some small, beige, 2 chairs and a table, the kind of room where people received bad news. He closed the door. Neither of them sat. "The man you were treating," Rask said. "What did you observe?" Emma considered how to answer that. Penetrating wounds inconsistent with the reported mechanism. Entry and exit channels suggesting a high-velocity projectile. Wound angles that didn't match a random assault. She paused. And a military format number sequence in his pocket. Rask looked at her for a moment. "You read the slip." "I unfolded it. I didn't have context for it." "His name is Warren Doyle. He's a DIA intelligence officer. He was 6 hours into a classified extraction when his transport was compromised." Rask's voice was flat and factual, the way briefings sound when the speaker has already processed the emotion of the information and moved past it. "He was shot twice. His team got him to the street. Anonymous call was one of his people buying time." Emma absorbed this. The paramedics were SPD adjacent? "One of them. We're still working out the shape of it." Rask's eyes moved to her face. "When Hayes tried to access the patient, did he identify what he wanted?" "No, he said Doyle was a person of interest. He didn't elaborate." "Did he seem to know who Doyle actually was?" Emma thought about the way Hayes had looked at the gurney, assessing, but not with the look of someone confronting a face they recognized. More like someone completing an assignment. "He knew he needed to reach the patient," she said. "I don't think he knew why." Rask was quiet for a moment. He looked at the beige wall like it had something useful on it. "You did the right thing, Emma." She'd heard him use her first name exactly twice in the years she'd served under him. Both times had been significant. "I did my job," she said. "You did more than that. You held a deteriorating patient stable under active interference from law enforcement for," he checked his watch, 23 minutes, without backup, without knowing who Doyle was or what was at stake. I knew what was at stake for him, Emma said. That was enough. Rask looked at her then with an expression she recognized from a long time ago, a field in a country she wasn't going to name in a hospital consultation room, the look of someone recalibrating their estimation of a situation. She'd seen it on his face once before, in circumstances that had also involved blood and bad odds and her doing something nobody had expected. We need to review the footage from this department, he said. Every camera, whatever happened in that corridor. Bay 3 has a camera, Emma said. So does the main nursing station. The hallway between them, I'm not certain. We'll find out. He moved toward the door, then stopped. Hayes is still out there. I know. He's going to be a problem. He already was a problem, Emma said. He just didn't have consequences yet. Rask opened the door. The next hour had the specific quality of controlled chaos that Emma associated with incidents she'd rather not repeat. Rask's team moved through the ER with quiet efficiency, requesting footage, speaking to staff, doing nothing that looked like a raid but accomplishing everything a raid accomplishes. 2 individuals arrived from outside the hospital, one in a dark suit carrying a federal credential Emma wasn't close enough to read, one in civilian clothes who went directly to the security office and didn't come out for 40 minutes. Hayes had finally made a phone call. Emma watched him through the bay window, standing near the ambulance entrance, phone pressed to his ear, face doing the thing faces do when the person on the other end is not saying what you wanted to hear. His 2 officers had drifted slightly away from him, subtle, instinctive, the way people put physical distance between themselves and someone who has suddenly become unpredictable. Darlene Kovach arrived at 11:15, 40 minutes before her scheduled shift, and Emma knew immediately that someone had called her. Darlene came through the ER doors, took in the soldiers, took in the suits, took in Hayes near the ambulance bay, took in Emma standing at the station with her arms crossed, and a look on her face that apparently communicated something specific, and said, with the calm of a woman who had managed emergency departments for 21 years, "Tell me what I walked into." Emma told her. Kept it sequential, kept it clinical, hit the relevant facts without editorializing. Darlene listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. When Emma finished, Darlene was quiet for about 3 seconds. Then she said, "The camera in Bay 3, that's the one you filed for last March." "Yes." "It records to the central server, not local storage." "Yes." Darlene nodded slowly. "Pemberton doesn't know that. He thinks it records to a local drive that security manages." Emma looked at her. "He came down here 20 minutes before you got in this morning," Darlene said. "Talked to night security. I think he was checking on something." She paused. "But if he thought he could control what that camera recorded, he was wrong." Emma let that land. "How long has that been the case? The server recording?" "Since February. IT upgrade. Nobody sent the memo to administration." Darlene's expression was completely neutral. "It happens." It happened, Emma thought, with the particular luck of situations that didn't feel like luck until several hours after they were over. "Darlene," Emma said, "Hayes is still in this building." "I can see that." "He told me he'd make sure I never worked here again." Darlene looked at her steadily. "Victor Hayes has been making threats in this ER for 6 years. You want to know how many of them stuck?" She picked up a chart from the station. 0. Because every time he opens his mouth in this department, there's a record of it. She moved toward Bay 2. "Let Rask's people do their job, Carter. You do yours." The patient from the scaffold accident, the construction worker from the morning, was being discharged when his wife arrived, 40 minutes late because of a bus delay, and she came in flustered and apologetic and immediately started crying when she saw him sitting upright with his wrist wrapped. Emma was passing through and stopped long enough to make sure the discharge instructions were clear, to answer 3 questions the attending had apparently glossed over, and to make sure the wife had the follow-up appointment written down on paper because she'd mentioned twice that she didn't have a working phone. It was a small thing. It took 6 minutes. Emma did it because it needed doing and because she was still technically on shift, and because sometimes the best thing you can do in the middle of a situation you can't fully control is be useful in a way you can. She was walking back from the discharge bay when she saw Pemberton. He was coming from the elevator, not the main one, the staff elevator at the end of the administrative corridor. and he was moving fast for a man who usually moved like he had nowhere to be. His face was tight. He wasn't looking at anyone directly. He saw Emma and stopped. She stopped. For a moment, they just looked at each other across 12 feet of corridor, and Emma thought, he knows about the server. Someone told him. He's been trying to figure out what's on it. Pemberton said, "You should have taken the administrative leave when I offered it last month." Emma blinked. That wasn't an offer. That was a suggestion during a staffing meeting. It was an opportunity. His voice was controlled, but something underneath it wasn't. There are people in this hospital who have been protecting this department, Carter. People who have made sure the funding stayed, that the equipment got replaced, that this ER kept operating at the level it does. You don't walk away from that kind of support without consequences. I don't know what that has to do with this morning, Emma said. It has everything to do with this morning. He took a step closer, and his voice dropped. Hayes came here as a courtesy. His department has relationships with our board that go back 15 years. The correct thing, the professional thing, would have been to accommodate that relationship for 5 minutes and let the legal process sort itself out later. The professional thing, Emma said carefully, would have killed a patient. You don't know that. His pressure was at 82/50. He had free fluid in his abdomen, every minute of delay. I don't need a medical lecture, Pemberton said sharply. Then what do you need? He looked at her for a long moment. I need you to understand that what happened this morning is going to be characterized by how people remember it, not by what's on any recording. Emma heard what he was saying. She heard it clearly. And she also heard, behind her and slightly to the left, the sound of shoes on linoleum that weren't moving, that had stopped. And she knew without turning that someone had been close enough to hear the last 30 seconds of that conversation. She turned. The federal agent in the dark suit was standing 8 feet away with a notepad and a pen and an expression of complete professional blandness. Pemberton saw him. The color left his face faster than Emma had ever seen color leave a face. Mr. Pemberton, the agent said pleasantly, I was hoping to speak with you about the hospital's security system, specifically the server configuration for camera storage. He smiled. Do you have a few minutes? Pemberton looked at Emma. There was something in his eyes that she didn't want to examine too closely. Not because it scared her, but because it reminded her of something she'd seen in other people in other situations, and the memory wasn't a good one. Then he turned and walked with the federal agent toward the administrative corridor, and Emma watched them go. The OR called at 12:47 p.m. Warren Doyle was out of surgery. Stable. The hemorrhage had been controlled, the internal damage repaired. It had been close, the resident told Emma on the phone, closer than the initial assessment suggested, but Asher had gotten everything he needed to get. Emma wrote it in the log. She didn't say anything out loud. Rask found her at the station 5 minutes later. He's going to make it, Emma said before he could speak. I know. Asher called me as well. Rask stood beside her, not in front of her, which she'd always appreciated about him. He didn't center himself in spaces. We've pulled the footage, all of it. He paused. Hayes' arrival is on camera. Everything he said is on audio. The contact with you, the physical contact, is documented. It wasn't severe, Emma said. Emma. He grabbed a nurse who was actively treating a critical patient in front of staff on camera, while under no legitimate legal authority to do so. Rask's voice was even. Define severe however you want, but the recording defines it differently. She didn't argue. What about Pemberton? The conversation he had with you in the corridor was partially recorded by the hall camera and fully overheard by Agent Merritt. A brief pause. The things he said about how events would be characterized, the implication about the server. Another pause. That's going to be someone else's problem to sort, but it's going to be sorted. Emma looked down at the log in front of her. She'd written Doyle's discharge vitals in her usual handwriting, slightly left-leaning, fast, the kind of handwriting that comes from years of documenting under pressure. It looked like every other entry she'd made today. Colonel, she said, what happens to Hayes now? Rask was quiet for a moment. That's not entirely in my hands. But you have input. I have testimony. My people have testimony. The DIA has a significant interest in what happened to their officer and how he was almost prevented from receiving care, and who facilitated that interference. He let that sentence sit for a moment. Hayes has been doing this for a long time, Emma. This morning isn't the first incident on his record. It's just the first one that had the right witnesses. The right witnesses, Emma thought, and a camera that nobody in the right places knew about. She thought about Pemberton's face in the corridor, the way it had looked when he realized what had been overheard, what had been recorded, what couldn't be managed or reframed or filed away in the wrong drawer. She'd seen that look on people before too, and it always meant the same thing. The calculation has changed. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Go ahead." "Doyle." The slip of paper in his pocket, the number sequence. She kept her voice low. "Was that a contact code?" Rask looked at her steadily. "You recognize the format." "I spent 3 years doing medevac with intelligence-adjacent units. I've seen the format." "Then you know what I can and can't confirm in an ER corridor." "I know what it means that Hayes was sent to reach him," Emma said. "It means someone in SPD, or someone connected to SPD, knew Doyle was in this building and wanted him inaccessible before your people arrived." Rask said nothing. "And it means Hayes either knew what he was doing or was used by someone who did," Emma continued. "And I'd guess the latter because Hayes doesn't read like someone who understands intelligence operations. He reads like someone who owed someone a favor." Rask's expression was still neutral, but his eyes had done something. A small shift, barely perceptible, that Emma read as, "That is correct, and I can neither confirm nor deny it, but do not stop thinking." "My job this morning was the patient," Emma said. "Whatever the rest of it is. That's your job and Agent Merritt's job and whoever else's job. But I need to know that it's going to be done." "It's going to be done," Rask said quietly. She looked at him. She'd known him for 8 years, served under him for 3 of those, and he had one quality that most senior officers she'd encountered did not have. He meant what he said. Not because he was perfect, he wasn't, and she'd seen the evidence of that too, but because he'd learned somewhere along the way that being believed was worth more than being comfortable. "Okay," she said. She turned back to the station. There were 2 new patients in triage, a medication consult pending in Bay 6, and a call from the 4th floor that had been sitting unanswered for 11 minutes. She picked up the phone. "Yes." Hayes left the building at 1:30 p.m. Emma didn't see him go. She was in Bay 6 when it happened, but Janelle told her afterward, and Janelle had been watching. He'd walked out the main entrance with his 2 officers, and just before the doors closed behind him, he turned and looked back into the ER. He'd stood there for maybe 3 seconds. "What was he looking at?" Emma asked. Janelle thought about it. "You, I think. Bay 6, the window?" Emma was quiet for a moment. "He looked, I don't know," Janelle said carefully, "like someone who just figured something out but wishes they hadn't." Emma nodded. She understood that feeling in a clinical kind of way. It was the feeling you get when the story you've been telling yourself about who has the power in a situation turns out to be wrong, and the correction comes not through argument or confrontation, but through reality simply organizing itself differently than you expected. Hayes had walked into this hospital this morning as a man who had never once been held accountable for how he used his authority. He was walking out of it as something else. He didn't fully know what yet. That would take time. But the shape of it had already been established, and no amount of phone calls or administrative relationships was going to change the geometry. The afternoon ground on the way the hospital afternoons do, full and relentless, no space between problems for anything like reflection. Emma treated a 7-year-old with a severe allergic reaction, talked a 60-year-old man through a panic attack he was convinced was cardiac, and assisted with 2 stitching cases that the ER resident handled competently, but slowly. She ate half a sandwich at the station at 3 p.m., and finished the other half at 4:15 because someone needed her in Bay 2 before she could get back to it. Rask's people remained in the building. She saw them in the corridors periodically, not intrusive, not present in ways that interfered with patient care, but there. The federal agent Merritt spent most of the afternoon in a room on the 2nd floor that had been converted into a temporary workspace. The civilian who'd gone to the security office came back out, spoke briefly to Rask, and left the building entirely. Emma didn't ask questions. She had work. Dr. Asher found her in the break room at 4:45, when she was the only person in it and the room was briefly, improbably quiet. He poured himself coffee that was probably 4 hours old and stood at the counter looking at it like he wasn't sure it was worth the effort. "Doyle's going to ICU," he said. "Good. Rask wants someone from our team to consult on his ongoing care, liaison type thing." Asher looked at the coffee, then at Emma. "I told him that would be you." Emma was quiet. "You don't have to," Asher said, "but he asked specifically, and honestly, after today, it would be—" He paused. "It would make sense." "It would," Emma said. "There's also going to be an incident report. Hospital Quality Committee, probably a state licensing board review depending on how the Hayes situation develops. I'm going to be documenting everything. My observations, the clinical timeline, what I witnessed with Pemberton." He looked at his coffee again. "I'm going to need your documentation to be complete." "It's complete," Emma said. "I documented in real time, everything." He nodded. He drank the coffee, made a face that suggested it had not improved with age. "Emma, I should have backed you up harder. When Pemberton came down." She looked at him. "You were trying to manage it." "I was trying to manage it in the wrong direction." He set the cup down. "I was thinking about the board meeting next month and the equipment request we have pending and the fact that Pemberton has 2 votes in the room. And I let that affect my clinical judgment for about—" He paused. 4 minutes. 4 minutes where I was on the wrong side of this." Emma considered that. 4 minutes wasn't nothing. 4 minutes in Doyle's case had been the difference between margins. But Asher had come back. He'd made the call when it mattered. And he was standing here now with bad coffee and an honest accounting, which was more than she got from most people. "Document everything you remember," she said. "That's what matters now." He nodded once. He left. Emma sat in the quiet break room for another 3 minutes. She thought about Warren Doyle, the way his BP had looked on the monitor, the way his injuries had spoken a language she'd had to learn in places most people would never go. She thought about Rask's people landing on the roof and what that meant about the reach of whatever operation Doyle had been running, the kind of infrastructure it took to scramble military personnel to a civilian hospital inside of an hour. She thought about Hayes and the way he'd grabbed her arm. Not with anger, exactly, more with the automatic assumption of the right to move someone who was in his way. She'd been moved before. By situations, by command structures, by the blunt force of rank and bureaucracy, and the specific cruelty that institutions deploy against the people who follow the rules the institution claims to want them to follow. She'd left the Army not because she was pushed, but because she'd made a choice. And she'd come to Northbridge Regional not because it was where she'd always wanted to be, but because it was where she'd landed, and she'd done her job here for 4 years in a state of relative invisibility that she had, honestly, partly cultivated. She hadn't wanted to be known. She hadn't wanted her record to precede her. She'd wanted to be a nurse in an emergency department and to do her work and go home and not carry the weight of everything she'd done before into a place that was supposed to be, in some sense, simpler. It had not stayed simple. But she was still here, and Doyle was in recovery, and Hayes was somewhere making phone calls to people who were going to tell him things he didn't want to hear. She stood up, smoothed her scrubs, and went back out onto the floor. The call came at 6:22 p.m., and she was not the one who received it. Darlene took it at the charge desk, and Emma watched from across the room as Darlene's face changed. Not dramatically, not the way faces change in movies, but in the small, precise way of someone receiving information that confirms something they already suspected. Darlene hung up. She looked across the room at Emma. "That was the Quality Committee director," Darlene said. "They've been asked by Internal Affairs to secure all documentation from today. Every chart, every incident report, every camera log." She paused. "Internal Affairs has opened a formal inquiry." Emma nodded. "Into Hayes," Darlene said, "and into Pemberton." Around the station, 2 nurses and an ER tech had gone very still. "That's the right outcome," Emma said. "There's more." Darlene looked at her clipboard, then back at Emma. "Rask's people found something in the security system. something unrelated to the cameras. She kept her voice low. Some access logs. Somebody with administrative credentials has been pulling patient records. Specific patients, the kind of patients who come in without identification. The room was very quiet. Emma felt something shift in the back of her mind, a pattern she'd been looking at without seeing, the edges of it suddenly connecting. Anonymous patients, administrative access, Hayes's urgency, Pemberton's comment about relationships that went back 15 years. How long? Emma asked. They're still pulling the logs, Darlene said. But the earliest access they've flagged is… She checked something on her clipboard. 14 months ago. 14 months. Emma thought about all the unnamed patients who'd come through the ER in the last 14 months. She thought about which ones had been rushed, which ones had been complicated, which ones had produced the particular low-grade friction that she'd attributed to ordinary hospital politics, and the ordinary friction of law enforcement and medicine sharing a space they both thought was theirs. She thought about a man in a hallway 6 months ago who'd arrived unconscious with no ID and had been checked out by a plainclothes officer within an hour. She'd flagged it internally. Nothing had come of it. Darlene, she said, the man 6 months ago, Bay 7, the one with the head trauma. Darlene looked at her. I remember him. Pull that record. Today. Emma glanced toward the corridor where she could see the edge of Agent Merritt's suit through the doorway. And give it to Merritt. Darlene was already moving. Emma turned back to the station. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. That was the thing about training that nobody tells you, the thing that takes years to understand and longer to trust. It doesn't make you calm. It makes your hands calm. The rest of you can be absolutely burning, and your hands will still do what they need to do. She picked up the chart in front of her and kept working. She didn't see Rask again until 7:45, when the shift was officially ending and she was at her locker pulling out her jacket, and he knocked on the open door of the locker room, a courtesy, she noted, and stood in the doorway. We found the access logs, he said. 14 separate incidents over 13 months. Patients with no identification, flagged by administrative credentials that trace back to… He paused. An account that Pemberton created under a subordinate's name. Emma pulled on her jacket. He was running a screen, Rask said. Anytime an unnamed patient came through this ER who matched certain criteria, age, injury type, circumstances of arrival, someone was notified, someone with an interest in whether those patients were reachable. His voice was measured but not comfortable. We don't know yet how far it goes, how many people knew, how many incidents were affected. But the DIA is going to pursue it, and so is Internal Affairs, and we have enough now to be certain that what happened to Doyle today was not random. Emma stood with one hand on her locker door. She'd known, in the abstract, the way you know things before you have the words for them, that this was bigger than one lieutenant and one morning. She'd known it since the paramedic had looked at her like he was being watched. Hayes was a tool, she said. Not a question. Probably. We're still mapping it. Rask paused. Emma, the DIA is going to want to debrief you formally. Your observations this morning, the paramedic's behavior, what you noticed about Doyle's wounds, the sequence of events, all of it is relevant. I'll be available, she said. Tomorrow, ideally. 9 a.m., if that works with your schedule. It works? He nodded. He started to turn, then stopped. You should know. Hayes made 4 phone calls in the 2 hours after he left this building. We know who he called. 2 of those calls are going to create additional problems for him. Emma looked at him. He called someone he shouldn't have called, Rask said simply. Someone whose number being in his call log is going to be very difficult to explain. Emma thought about Hayes standing by the ambulance bay, phone to his ear, face doing something wrong. She thought about the calculation he'd been making. Who could fix this? Who could make the recordings disappear? Who had the reach? He'd called the wrong person. Or maybe the right person from his perspective, who was now the wrong person from every other perspective. She closed her locker. Tell me one thing, if I can. Doyle, when he wakes up, is he going to know what happened in that bay this morning? Rask looked at her. He'll know everything. Emma picked up her bag. She said goodnight to Darlene, who was still at the desk with 3 charts and a cold cup of tea. doing what charge nurses do at the end of difficult shifts, making sure every piece of paper was where it was supposed to be. She walked out through the ER, past Bay 3, where the camera she'd filed for last March was still recording, past the nurses' station where Janelle had been replaced by the evening crew, past the main entrance where Hayes had stood looking back into the room. The night air hit her cold and sharp, the way Stonehaven air always did after dark, even in spring. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She looked at it for a second, then answered. Silence. Then a voice she didn't recognize, male, careful, speaking just above a whisper. Nurse Carter, you don't know me, but there are 6 more patients in the last 14 months. A pause. 6 more incidents like Doyle, and 2 of them didn't make it. The line went dead. Emma stood on the sidewalk outside Northbridge Regional Hospital with her phone in her hand and the Stonehaven night going cold around her, and she looked up at the building. At the lit windows, at the roof where the military helicopters had landed and left, at the emergency department where she had worked for 4 years without anyone knowing who she really was. 2 of them didn't make it. She put her phone in her pocket and started walking back toward the entrance. She went back through the entrance without deciding to. Her feet moved and the rest of her followed, which was how she'd operated in a lot of situations that required moving before thinking caught up. The ER night shift was 8 minutes old. Different faces at the station, same fluorescent light, same underlying smell of antiseptic and recycled air. The evening charge nurse, a man named Ortega, whom Emma knew by reputation more than conversation, looked up when she came back through. Forgot something? He asked. I need Merritt, Emma said. Federal agent, 2nd floor. He left about 20 minutes ago. Emma stopped. Do you have a number? I don't. Rask might. She pulled out her phone and called Rask directly. He picked up on the second ring, which told her he hadn't been asleep and that he'd probably been expecting something to come in tonight. Someone called me, she said. Didn't identify themselves. Male voice spoke quietly, like he was somewhere he wasn't supposed to be. He said there are 6 more incidents like Doyle's in the last 14 months. She paused. And that 2 of the patients died. A long silence on Rask's end, not the silence of surprise. The silence of someone updating a calculation. Say the number again, he said. 6 more, 2 fatalities. Another pause. Where are you? ER entrance. Stay there. He was back in the building 11 minutes later, which meant he hadn't gone far. He came through the main doors with Merritt beside him. The agent had his jacket off and his sleeves rolled, the look of someone who'd been working through dinner. They moved Emma to the same consultation room from that morning, and this time all 3 of them sat. She told them everything she remembered about the call. Duration, tone, the specific phrasing. She'd been listening the way she listened in clinical situations, for information, not comfort, so she had it close to verbatim. Merritt was writing. Unknown number. Did you try calling back? The moment the line went dead, disconnected. Burner, probably. He looked at Rask. Or a hospital line, someone still in the building. The timing, Rask said. You walked out at what, 7:50? Approximately. Call came within a minute of you leaving. Emma had registered that without fully articulating it. Someone was watching for me to leave, either from inside or from a window. Merritt tapped his pen against his notepad. The 6 incidents. You think this is someone who works here? The access logs were internal, Emma said. If there are 6 more, then whoever is talking about them either pulled the same logs we did or was close enough to the process to know what they contained. Or they were one of the patients, Rask said quietly. The room went still. Emma thought about that. A patient who had survived, who had understood what had happened to them, or understood enough to be frightened, and who had been watching the news or a colleague's social media or the hospital's own administrative channels for some signal that the situation was shifting. If 2 people died, Emma said, and this person knows about it, they're either involved in the system that enabled it, or there's someone who tried to report it and was shut down. Or both, Merritt said. He stood up. He and Rask exchanged a look that had the compressed quality of people who'd worked together long enough to communicate efficiently, and then Rask turned to Emma. Go home, he said. I mean it this time. We're going to pull the full log, all 14 months, every flagged access entry, every unnamed patient who came through this ER. We'll cross-reference against outcome records. He looked at her steadily. If there are 2 deaths in that data, we will find them. Tonight. Emma looked at him. You know what that means if you do? Yes. It means what happened to Doyle wasn't an isolated act. It means Pemberton's access log is connected to patient deaths. She kept her voice level, but it cost something. It means this hospital has been a part of something that killed people. We don't know that yet, Merritt said. Not dismissively, carefully, the way investigators are careful, because the thing that sounds true and the thing that is true are not always the same thing, and the distance between them is where cases fall apart. You know it might be, Emma said. Yes, he said. We know it might be. She left. This time, she made it all the way home. Brant. She didn't sleep much. She'd expected that. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building 6 blocks from the hospital, close enough that she'd walked to work for 4 years in all weather, far enough that she couldn't hear the ambulance bays from her window. She sat at her kitchen table with a glass of water and her phone face up in front of her, and did the things she'd learned to do in situations where she had no control over the next development. She cataloged what she knew, organized it sequentially, and then set it aside. The patient in Bay 7, 6 months ago. She'd flagged it. Nothing had come of it. She turned that over a few times. Had it come of nothing because Pemberton had buried it, or because the connection hadn't been visible yet from the inside? She didn't know. She wouldn't know tonight. She set it aside. The man on the phone. The specific way he'd said 6 more. Not approximately, not roughly. 6. A number he was certain of, which meant he'd counted. You only count something when you're trying to decide whether it's enough. She fell asleep in the chair at some point after midnight and woke up at 5:40 a.m. with her phone buzzing. Rask. We found them, he said when she answered. His voice was different from last night, not softer, but heavier. 2 patients, 14 and 9 months ago, respectively. Both came in as unnamed John Does, both received unauthorized administrative access within the first 30 minutes of arrival. Both died during or shortly after their ER visit. Emma's hand tightened on the phone. Cause of death on the first is documented as cardiac arrest secondary to traumatic injury, Rask said. The second, respiratory failure. A pause. Both deaths were signed off by the attending on duty. Both attendings have since left Northbridge, one relocated to a different state. Emma closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then she opened them. Was it the injuries that killed them or something else? That's what the investigation is going to determine. His voice was careful. We're not making that determination this morning, but the DIA and Merritt's team are requesting a formal forensic review of both case files, and the state medical board is being notified within the hour. She stood up from the chair, moved to the window. Stonehaven outside at dawn. Gray light, empty street, a delivery truck 3 blocks down. Does the board know yet? Pemberton is in federal custody as of 4 a.m. this morning, Rask said. Arrested on obstruction charges, with additional charges pending the forensic review. His access to hospital systems has been terminated. A brief pause. The board has been notified. They're calling an emergency session. Emma looked at the delivery truck. It had stopped. The driver was unloading something. Ordinary, methodical, unconcerned. What about Hayes? She asked. Still in the city, his union rep has been contacted and he's been placed on administrative leave pending the internal affairs review. Rask's tone indicated what he thought of that outcome for the moment. The call log from yesterday. The 2 calls we flagged. One of them was to a city councilman who has financial ties to a private security contractor that we now believe was using this hospital as a soft access point for intelligence on unnamed patients. She absorbed that. Using SPD as a facilitator. Indirectly. Hayes may not have known the full picture. That doesn't make him less culpable for this morning, but it changes the shape of the investigation. He paused. Emma, I need you at the hospital at 8. I'll be there. Not for patient care. Doyle is conscious. He's asking for you. Warren Doyle looked smaller in the ICU bed than he had on the gurney, which was always the way. The crisis strips something away, and what's left is the person without the emergency around them. Just a man with tubes and monitors and a face that was processing things in the particular private way of people who'd come close enough to see what was on the other side and preferred not to revisit it. He was awake when Emma came in, and his eyes tracked to her immediately. He had dark eyes, alert despite the sedation still working out of his system, the kind of eyes that had spent years watching rooms. "Nurse Carter," he said. His voice was rough, abraded. "Mr. Doyle." She checked his monitor out of instinct before she sat, read the numbers, was satisfied. "How's the pain?" "Manageable." He looked at her. "Rask told me what happened. Some of it, I'm sure. He told me enough." Doyle was quiet for a moment. He seemed to be deciding something, the way people decide things when they've been recently reminded of their own fragility and it's clarified their priorities. "I was conscious for part of it," he said. "More than I let on. I could hear your voice." Emma was quiet. "You didn't stop," he said. "Even when you didn't stop." "You were bleeding," Emma said. "Stopping wasn't an option." "The man who came in, Hayes." "Yes. I've been briefed." His jaw tightened slightly. Not anger, but something working through him. "I want to testify. Whatever they need from me, whenever they need it, I'll be there." He looked at her directly. "I want it on record that the delay he caused, the interference, was material. That it was clinically significant. That without what you did in that room, I wouldn't be here to testify to anything." Emma held his gaze for a moment. "Your testimony will carry weight," she said, "but my documentation is complete. The footage exists. You focus on getting your lung capacity back." He almost smiled. "Not quite. You're not going to let me be grateful, are you?" "I'm going to let you recover," she said. "The gratitude can wait." She stood to leave. At the door, she paused. "The investigation is going to ask you about what you know," she said. "About the access log, the other patients. About the larger operation." "I know," Doyle said. "Whatever you can share is going to matter. Not just for Hayes and Pemberton. For the people who came before you." He understood her meaning. She saw it move through his face. "How many?" he asked. "They're still counting," Emma said. She left the ICU and walked back toward the administrative wing, where the emergency board session was now 40 minutes from starting, and where, according to the text Rask had sent her at 7:55, 3 board members had already demanded a full external audit of the hospital's relationship with SPD over the past 5 years. She was halfway down the corridor when the administrator's assistant, a young woman named Petra, who had always been professional and courteous, and who was now visibly operating on about 3 hours of sleep, fell into step beside her. "Ms. Carter, the board is requesting you attend the session." Emma kept walking. "In what capacity?" "As a witness to the events of yesterday, and—" Petra hesitated. "There's something else. A reporter from the Stonehaven Courier has been outside the main entrance since 6 this morning, and 2 network affiliates arrived 20 minutes ago." Emma stopped. "Someone called the media," Petra said. "We don't know who." Emma thought about the anonymous caller. The man with the careful voice who had known the number 6, who had been watching for her to leave, who had counted. He hadn't just called her, he'd called everyone. "How much do they know?" Emma asked. "Enough," Petra said. "They're asking about a military operation, a police lieutenant, and 2 patient deaths." Emma stood in the middle of the corridor of Northbridge Regional Hospital, the building that had tried to discard her yesterday morning, and she felt the shape of the next several hours arrange themselves in front of her with the particular clarity of situations that have passed the point of containment. Whatever had been managed in shadow for 14 months was about to happen in full light. And somewhere in the building, or somewhere in the city, the man who had made both phone calls was either very relieved or very afraid. And Emma had the sharp, cold feeling that it might be both, and that his reasons for being afraid had nothing to do with her and everything to do with whoever he'd been careful not to name. Her phone rang. Unknown number, same number as last night. She'd saved it as unknown, and now it was calling back. She answered. "They know I talked," the voice said. No preamble.
quieter than before, and this time she could hear something underneath the quiet. Breath, unsteady. I need to come in. I need a sound on the line, movement, something falling. Carter, I'm at... The line cut out, not disconnected. Cut. Emma was already moving toward the entrance, phone in hand, calling Rask's number with her other hand, because the man on the phone had just shifted from witness to something more urgent, and she was a trauma nurse, and she knew the difference between a call that ends and a call that stops. Rask picked up on this first ring. Someone called me again, Emma said, already through the ER doors and into the main entrance corridor. Same number as last night. He said they know he talked. He said he needed to come in. The line cut. Not dropped. Cut. A half-second pause. Location? He started to say, didn't finish. She heard Rask moving on his end, quick, purposeful. I'm calling Merritt. Stay in the building. He might be hurt. Emma. Stay in the building. She stopped at the main entrance. Outside, she could see the courier reporter on the sidewalk, a camera crew from one of the affiliates setting up across the street, a second van pulling in behind them. The media presence had doubled in the last 20 minutes, and it would double again. Stonehaven wasn't a large city, but a military operation at a civilian hospital, 2 patient deaths, a police lieutenant on administrative leave. That was enough to make the national wire by noon. She stayed in the building. She stood at the entrance with her hand on her phone and watched the street and thought about the voice on the line, the way it had changed from last night to this morning. Last night it had been careful, controlled. A man delivering information he'd decided to deliver. This morning it had been afraid. The quality of the fear was specific, not panic, but the fear of someone who has just understood that a line has been crossed and the crossing cannot be undone. Rask appeared from the elevator 8 minutes later with Merritt beside him and a uniformed SPD officer Emma didn't recognize. Not one of Hayes's people, someone new, someone who had the demeanor of a person operating under different instructions. The number triangulated to a payphone, Merritt said by way of greeting. 4 blocks east, patrols en route. Payphone, Emma said. There are 3 of them left in Stonehaven. Relic infrastructure. He looked at her steadily. He's been careful. Both calls from payphones, different ones. He knew what he was doing. Until this morning, Emma said. Until this morning. The uniformed officer's radio crackled. He moved to the side and listened, and his expression did the thing that trained faces do when they receive information they weren't expecting, a fractional tightening, a recalibration. He came back to Rask. Patrol found a man at the payphone location, unconscious, blunt trauma to the head. EMS is en route. Emma was already turning toward the ER bay. Bring him here, she said. Not a suggestion. That's the closest trauma center, Merritt said into his phone, presumably to whoever had the patrol on the line. Northbridge. Yes. Now. The man's name, they found out 40 minutes later, was Dale Pritchard. 51 years old, a former hospital IT contractor who had left Northbridge Regional's employ 11 months ago under what his personnel file described as a mutual separation agreement. He had a small laceration on the back of his skull, a concussion, and the particular kind of controlled shock that comes from being hit hard enough to go down, but not hard enough to stay down long. He was conscious by the time the ambulance brought him in, which was either fortunate or the result of someone calculating exactly how much force to use to shut him up without creating a death that would draw immediate investigation. Emma triaged him, kept her voice clinical, did not let her own reading of the situation affect her clinical assessment. He had a concussion. He needed imaging. He needed to be observed. He also needed to not be left alone. She arranged both. Rask stationed one of his people outside Pritchard's bay. Merritt came in to speak with him briefly, gently, professionally, and Pritchard talked, haltingly at first, and then with the particular rush of someone who has been holding something for a long time and has finally found a container that can receive it. Emma wasn't in the room for most of it. She had a department to help run and 3 other patients who needed her, and she was not an investigator. But Merritt briefed her afterward, standing at the station with his notepad and the slightly hollow look of someone who has confirmed something they were hoping was wrong. Pritchard had been the IT technician who'd installed the camera server upgrade in February.
He'd also been, for the 8 months before that, the person who had configured and maintained the administrative access system that Pemberton used to flag unnamed patients. He hadn't known, at first, what the flags were for. He'd thought it was a billing verification system. It had been presented to him as routine. He'd figured it out 9 months ago when he'd gone into the system to do a routine maintenance check and found access logs that didn't match any billing protocol he'd ever seen. Timestamps in the middle of the night, access by a credential set that he knew was Pemberton's but was registered under a junior administrator named Kowalski, who had, by that point, already resigned. He'd pulled the patient records the logs pointed to. He'd seen the outcomes. He'd tried to report it internally. His supervisor at the contracting firm had told him to document everything and bring it to the firm's legal department. The firm's legal department had told him, 3 days later, that they'd reviewed it and found no actionable concern. A week after that, his contract with Northbridge had been terminated. He'd spent the last 11 months deciding what to do. He didn't go to the police, Merritt told Emma, because Hayes's name was in the secondary logs, not as the system user, as the person who received the notifications, his department email. Merritt paused. Pritchard recognized the name. He'd seen Hayes in the hospital enough times to know the relationship wasn't incidental. Emma was quiet for a moment. So he waited. He watched. He kept copies of everything, off-site, personal storage, encrypted. When yesterday happened, the helicopters, the military presence, the media outside, he decided it was the right window. Someone found out he'd called. The payphone cameras, Merritt said. There are 3 payphones left in Stonehaven. All 3 have city surveillance cameras within range. Someone pulled the footage from last night's call and identified him this morning. He paused. That took resources, the kind of resources that come from having relationships inside the city's surveillance infrastructure. Emma thought about the councilman Rask had mentioned, the financial ties to the private security contractor, the reach. Who hit him? She asked. We don't know yet, but we're going to. Merritt looked at his notes. He had copies of the access logs, digital, on a drive he carries. He's been carrying it for 11 months, which tells you something about where his head has been. He looked up at Emma. The drive corroborates everything. 6 additional incidents, 2 deaths, 14 months of systematic patient monitoring through administrative access. It's complete. Emma stood with her hands flat on the desk. The ER around her was running normally. Patients, noise, movement, the ordinary business of a department that hadn't stopped being a department just because everything else had changed. Ortega, who'd been holding the night shift together, was giving her updates between calls, and she was processing them, responding correctly, doing her job. But underneath all of it, she was doing arithmetic, and the arithmetic was not comfortable. 14 months of access logs, 8 confirmed incidents, 2 dead, and a system that had been running through this hospital, through the institution that employed her, that she had walked into every morning and trusted with her presence and her license, with the knowledge and facilitation of people who had the authority to stop it. The board session, she said, starts in 20 minutes. Rask and I will both be present. Merritt looked at her. You should be there too. I'm on shift. Darlene's here. She can cover. He paused. Emma, you're not just a witness anymore. You're the person who kept the chain of evidence intact by keeping Doyle alive. The board needs to understand what this hospital's administrative structure enabled, and they need to hear it from someone who was in that bay yesterday morning. She knew he was right. She didn't love that he was right. She found Darlene at the medication station and told her. Darlene said, "Go," without looking up from what she was doing, and then looked up. "And come back and tell me everything." Tokam. The board session was held in the 3rd floor conference room, which had a long table, inadequate ventilation, and the specific institutional beige of rooms that had been designed to look neutral and had succeeded beyond anyone's intentions. 8 board members were present, 3 attending remotely on a screen at the far end. 2 of the in-person members had their legal counsel with them, which Emma noted and filed. Rask presented first. He was concise, structured, and relentless in the way that people who brief military command are relentless. No wasted words, no cushioning, just sequence and implication laid out with the precision of someone who understood that clarity was a form of respect for the severity of the situation. He covered the DIA operation, Doyle's identity and role, the intelligence suggesting that Northbridge Regional had been used as an access point for identifying and reaching intelligence-adjacent patients. He covered Hayes's involvement. He covered Pemberton's access logs and the connection to Pritchard's records. He did not speculate about the two deaths. He presented the facts and stated that forensic review was underway. The room was very quiet by the time he finished. Merritt went next. He was different from Raskin's style. Less military, more methodical. The kind of presenter who builds a case the way a wall is built, each brick sitting flush before the next one goes on. He walked the board through the timeline of administrative access, the credential chain, the contractor relationship, the prior internal report that had been suppressed. He presented Pritchard's drive as supporting evidence and described Pritchard's current status as a protected witness. Then he looked at Emma. She'd spent 4 years in this hospital not talking about herself. She'd answered questions when asked, filled out forms accurately, done her job. She had not stood up in front of institutional authority and described her own professional conduct because she'd never needed to, and honestly, because she'd preferred not to. She stood up now. She was not a polished speaker. She didn't try to be. She described the morning in the same terms she'd used to write a clinical note. Sequential, specific, with the particular cadence of someone who has been trained to report what was observed rather than what was felt. She described Doyle's condition on arrival, her clinical assessment, the decision to prioritize surgical intervention, the series of interruptions from Hayes and Pemberton, the point at which she'd been physically removed from a patient she was actively treating. She described the camera in Bay 3 and the fact that it recorded to a central server, and that the recording existed in its entirety. She described Pemberton's comment in the corridor about how events would be characterized. She kept her voice level when she said it, because if she let herself feel it right now, she'd lose the thread, and she needed the thread. When she finished the board chair, a woman named Aldridge, mid-60s, the kind of face that has weathered a lot without becoming either hard or soft, looked at her for a long moment. "Nurse Carter," Aldridge said, "you've been on staff here for 4 years." "Yes." "During that time, did you ever observe other incidents you considered irregular? Patients arriving without identification, administrative personnel taking unusual interest in specific cases?" Emma thought about Bay 7. "Yes. I documented one incident 6 months ago. I flagged it through internal channels. I received no response." Aldridge looked at the board member beside her, a man named Fortis, who had, Emma noticed, not made eye contact with anyone since the session began. "That would be an incident report processed through operations," Aldridge said carefully, "which would fall under the administrative oversight of Richard Pemberton's office," Emma said. The room absorbed that. Fortis moved slightly in his chair. He had the look of a man who had spent the last 2 hours slowly understanding the shape of the trap he was sitting inside. "Mr. Fortis," Merritt said pleasantly, "I'll need to speak with you after this session." Fortis's legal counsel put a hand on his arm. The board session ran 90 minutes over its scheduled time. By the end of it, the following had been formally moved and approved: an immediate suspension of all administrative personnel with access to the patient identification system pending review, a full external audit of Northbridge Regional's relationship with SPD over the preceding 5 years, a request to the State Medical Board for emergency oversight, and the appointment of an interim operations director to replace Pemberton while criminal proceedings were underway. Fortis left with his lawyer. Nobody stopped him from leaving. The people whose job it was to be interested in where he went were already interested. Emma walked out of the board session at 11:20 and went back to the ER. The media presence outside had doubled again. She counted 4 satellite trucks as she came down the stairwell. Someone was going to have to say something to them eventually. Rask, probably, or a hospital spokesperson. But that wasn't her role, and she didn't intend to make it her role. Darlene was at the station. "How was it?" she asked. "Long," Emma said. She put on new gloves. "What do we have?" "Bay 2 needs discharge review. Bay 5 has a chest pain that Ortega started the workup on, but he's off in 20 minutes. Bay 7,
Darlene paused, which was unusual for her. Bay 7 is someone who says they know you. Emma looked up. Walked in on her own, Darlene said. Sat down in triage and said she needed to speak with Emma Carter before she talked to anyone else. She hasn't given a name. Emma moved to Bay 7. The woman was perhaps 45, dressed in clothing that read professional, but had been worn for too long. The subtle rumple of someone who'd slept in their car or not slept at all. She had dark circles and a cut on her hand that she'd wrapped herself in a gas station bandage, and she was sitting on the edge of the exam table with the particular stillness of someone who has made a decision and is waiting to see if it was the right one. She looked at Emma. "You're Carter," she said. "I am. I was the attending on the first John Doe death, 14 months ago." She said it flat, no preamble, the way people say things they have been rehearsing for a long time. His name was Marcus Osei. He was a DIA courier. He came in with a gunshot wound, and I treated him, and then a man came into the bay and told me the patient was a federal detainee under SPD custody, and that I needed to step out. She looked at her wrapped hand. I stepped out. I shouldn't have. When I came back, he was in cardiac arrest. A pause. I ran the code. I couldn't bring him back. Emma was very still. I wrote it up as traumatic cardiac arrest secondary to GSW, the woman continued, because that's what the chart supported. Because I was terrified, and I didn't know who the man in the bay was, and I didn't know what I'd walked into. She looked at Emma directly. I've known for 11 months what I did wrong. I didn't know how to fix it. What's your name? Emma said. Dr. Sylvia Noor. I left Northbridge 8 months ago. I'm in private practice now in Millhaven. Emma looked at her, at the cut hand, the sleepless face, the way she was sitting. Did someone threaten you? Not directly. I received a phone call 2 months after Osei died. Someone told me that my documentation was complete, that the case was closed, and that any attempt to reopen it would result in a licensing review for my conduct during the treatment. She exhaled slowly. I'm not proud of what I did. I'm telling you now, because... She stopped. Because yesterday happened, and because I've been watching the news this morning, and because I'm not going to be the person who knows and says nothing. Emma pulled up a stool and sat down, because this was a conversation that needed a different geometry than standing over someone. You need to talk to a federal agent named Merritt, Emma said. He's in this building right now. He's going to treat what you tell him as protected testimony. I know I may face consequences for the documentation, Noor said. I know what I wrote may not have been accurate. That's something for the medical board and possibly the DA to assess, Emma said. But the person who created the situation that led to that documentation, Pemberton, is in federal custody as of this morning. The system that enabled it is being dismantled today. What you tell Merritt may be the thing that connects Osei's death to the people actually responsible for it. She paused. His name was Marcus Osei. He deserves to be named. Something crossed Noor's face, grief, maybe, or the particular relief of being seen. She looked down at her wrapped hand. I've been saying his name in private for 14 months, she said quietly. It helps less than you'd think. Emma sat with her for another 10 minutes, which was longer than she probably had, and then she walked Noor to Merritt herself, because some things you don't hand off at a corridor junction and walk away from. The afternoon moved in layers. Hayes's union representative released a statement at 1 p.m. describing the events of the previous morning as a misunderstanding and affirming Hayes's 22 years of distinguished service. The statement was posted on SPD's official communications page and removed 45 minutes later, which told Emma that whoever managed SPD's public communications had read the Courier's noon article and understood that the statement was a liability rather than a defense. The Courier article had a photograph pulled from the hospital's external security camera, of Colonel Rask's vehicles outside the main entrance, 2 military personnel visible, the overall composition of the image communicating in a single frame. Everything the text then spent 800 words elaborating. Emma had been told by Petra that 3 national outlets had picked up the Wire story by noon. By 2 p.m., it was 5. She treated patients. A teenager with a broken collarbone from a bicycle fall,
attended by a father who was more shaken than the kid and needed as much reassurance as the patient did. A woman in her 60s with a hypertensive crisis who was frightened and hadn't been managing her medication because she'd been rationing it, which was a different kind of crisis, and one Emma spent 15 minutes on the phone addressing with a social worker before she felt the situation was stable in the right direction. 2 laceration cases. A pediatric asthma patient who responded well to treatment and whose mother cried with relief in a way that Emma found, despite everything, briefly steadying. At 3:15, Rask came to the ER with an expression that had the controlled quality of someone carrying news they want to deliver correctly. Doyle gave his formal statement an hour ago, he said. It's been submitted to the IA review and to the DIA's internal investigation. He paused. He was clear, specific. The statement covers what happened in Bay 3 yesterday. The delay in care, Hayes' conduct, Emma's intervention. He named you by name and described your actions in clinical detail. He's a DIA intelligence officer, Emma said. He knows how to give a statement. He was thorough, Rask agreed. He also included something I didn't ask him to include. He looked at her. He described the number sequence on the slip of paper, what it was, why he was carrying it, why it was important that it not be found. Emma had thought about that slip of paper a few times over the last 36 hours. She'd read the format and recognized it and set it aside, and then she'd put it back on the tray when she handed off the patient, and she hadn't asked what it was or told anyone she'd seen it until Rask had asked her directly. It was a contact authentication code, Rask said, the kind used by field assets to verify identity when reaching a support network. If Hayes had reached Doyle in that bay and found that slip, or if Doyle had died before we arrived. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Emma was quiet for a moment. The network would have been exposed. More than that, the people whose names were embedded in that code would have been identifiable. And some of those people are currently operating in the field. Rask's voice was even. You protected an active intelligence network, Emma, without knowing it. I protected a patient, she said. Yes. He looked at her with the same expression he'd had in the consultation room the previous morning, the recalibration. Both things are true simultaneously. She didn't know what to say to that, so she didn't say anything. At 4:30, Internal Affairs held a press briefing outside the Stonehaven Police Department's main building, 6 blocks from Northbridge Regional. Emma didn't attend, obviously, but the ER had a break room with a television, and Ortega had it on, and a small and growing cluster of off-duty staff kept drifting in and then pretending they hadn't been watching. The IA deputy director, a careful woman named Sutherland, read from a prepared statement. Lieutenant Victor Hayes had been suspended without pay, pending the outcome of a formal investigation into allegations of abuse of authority, illegal interference with emergency medical treatment, and obstruction of a federal investigation. The investigation had been initiated as a result of events at Northbridge Regional Hospital on the previous morning in conjunction with a federal inquiry conducted by agents from the Department of Justice. She noted that additional officers and civilian personnel might be subject to review depending on the progress of the investigation. She did not take questions. In the break room, nobody said anything for about 4 seconds. Then a night shift orderly said quietly, "About time." And someone else nodded, and then everyone drifted back out to their stations because the ER didn't stop for press briefings any more than it stopped for anything else. Emma was in Bay 5 writing notes when Darlene appeared in the doorway. "Someone's here for you," Darlene said. "I'm with a patient. He says he's a lawyer." A pause. "Not the hospital's lawyer, your lawyer." Emma looked up. "I don't have a lawyer." "Then apparently you've been assigned one." Darlene held out a card. Clean, simple, a law firm name Emma didn't recognize. He said the Department of Defense arranged it. Pro bono representation in connection with any employment action, licensing review, or civil matter arising from your conduct yesterday. She paused. "That's a sentence I wasn't expecting to say today." Emma looked at the card. She thought about Pemberton's comment in the corridor, about events being characterized by how people remember them rather than what was on any recording. She thought about the administrative leave he'd mentioned, the suggestion from last month she'd dismissed as irrelevant. "Tell him I'll be with him in 15 minutes, she said, and went back to her patient. The lawyer's name was Garrison, mid-40s, unhurried in a way that read as confidence rather than indifference. He met her in the consultation room, the same beige room where she'd sat with Rask twice now, and he laid out the situation in clean, unambiguous terms. The DOD had engaged his firm to ensure that Emma's professional interests were protected through whatever proceedings arose from the previous 24 hours. This included any attempt by Northbridge Regional to initiate employment action against her, any licensing complaint filed with the state nursing board, and any civil action by parties who might seek to characterize her conduct as a contributing factor in any patient outcome. "Is the hospital planning employment action?" Emma asked. "The hospital's current legal position is complicated," Garrison said, which was a careful way of saying several things at once. "There are board members who understand that initiating action against you right now would be strategically catastrophic. There are others whose exposure in the current investigation means that their judgment cannot be trusted." He paused. "What I can tell you is that my job is to make sure that whatever happens next, your license and your livelihood are not collateral damage." Emma looked at him. "Who authorized this? Rask?" "The authorization came from above Colonel Rask's level," he said. "That's all I've been told to share." She sat with that for a moment. Someone in the DOD, someone with the reach to arrange pro bono legal representation for a civilian nurse within 36 hours of an incident, had decided that Emma Carter's professional future was worth protecting. That was either because of what she knew or because of what she'd done, or both. She thought, it shouldn't take a DIA operation for an ER nurse to have someone in her corner. She thought, but here we are. "What do I need to do?" she asked. "Right now? Nothing. Continue doing your job. Document everything, which I understand you've already been doing meticulously. Don't speak to hospital administration without me present." He clicked his pen closed. "The situation is developing in a direction that, frankly, favors you. But developing situations have a way of producing unexpected complications, and I want to be in front of any of those before they reach you." Emma nodded. She stood to go. "One more thing," Garrison said. "The hospital board is meeting again tomorrow morning. There's likely to be a formal statement, possibly a public apology. They're going to want to discuss the terms with you beforehand." "The terms," Emma said. "What form the apology takes, whether it involves a public acknowledgement of what occurred and how your role is characterized." "My role," Emma said slowly, "is that I was a nurse doing her job. That's how it should be characterized." Garrison looked at her. "That's likely to be a popular characterization with the media, who are currently outside in significant numbers." "I'm not doing this for the media." "I know," he said. "That's partly why the media will be interested." She left the consultation room and went back to the ER and finished her shift. At 7 p.m., Pritchard was well enough to move out of observation and into a supervised room. His concussion was moderate, but not severe, and he'd spent most of the afternoon talking to Merritt, and by the time Emma checked on him briefly, he had the deflated, lightened quality of someone who has set down a weight they've been carrying alone for so long they'd stopped noticing how heavy it was. 11 months, he said when Emma came in. He wasn't talking to her specifically, more to the ceiling. "I kept thinking someone was going to figure it out, that I wouldn't have to be the one." "You were the one, though," Emma said. "I was scared," he said. "I know. I still am." "That's reasonable," she said. "You got hit on the head this morning." He almost laughed. It came out wrong, too short, but it was an attempt. "The drive? Merritt has it?" "He has it. Everything's on it. All 14 months. Every access log, the patient records I flagged, the timestamps." He looked at the ceiling. "Pemberton is going to say it was routine. That's what he's going to say. That the flags were administrative, that the access was for billing verification, that he didn't know who was receiving the notifications." "He can say whatever he wants," Emma said. "The records say something different." "They do," Pritchard said. "They say exactly what happened." He paused. "Is it enough?" Emma thought about Doyle's statement and Noor's testimony and the footage from Bay 3 and Merritt's methodical brick-by-brick presentation and the call logs on Hayes's phone. "It's enough," she said. She turned to leave. At the door he said, "Carter." She turned. "The man I told you about on the phone, Oh, say. He looked at her. I pulled his record when I first found the logs. His next of kin was a sister in Trenton. She was never notified properly. He swallowed. Somebody should tell her what actually happened. Emma was very still. Merritt's team will make sure of that. You sure? I'll make sure of that, she said. Personally. She walked out of the room and down the corridor, and she was halfway to the station when her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Different from the payphone texts. A clean number. A local Stonehaven area code. She opened it. It was a photograph. Victor Hayes, coming out of a building she didn't immediately recognize, photographed from distance. Beside him was a man she'd never seen, younger, in a dark coat. The timestamp on the photograph was from this afternoon, after Hayes' suspension had been announced. Beneath the photo, one line of text. He met with the contractor's logistics director 2 hours after IA announced the review. They were together for 47 minutes. Emma stood in the corridor with her phone and read the text twice. Hayes had been suspended. He'd been told to stay available for IA review. He had no authority, no badge, no legitimate reason to be meeting with anyone connected to the network that Merritt was currently dismantling. But he was meeting with someone anyway, which meant Hayes wasn't just a tool who'd been used. Hayes knew enough about the network, about the contractor, about whatever the access logs connected to, that they still needed him, or he still needed them. She called Rask. I just received a photograph, she said. Hayes, taken this afternoon. He's meeting with someone. She looked at the image again. I need you to identify the building. A pause. Send it. She sent it. The pause on Rask's end was longer this time, long enough that she started walking, toward the exit, toward the night air, toward the camera crews who were still there, still waiting because the story hadn't finished resolving itself. Emma? Rask said. What is it? That building. Another pause. That's the Stonehaven City Records office. It's closed at this hour. A beat. There should be nobody in that building right now. Emma looked at the timestamp on the photograph again. 5:47 p.m. Then why, she said slowly, does the light in the third-floor window show someone is? Rask didn't say anything for 3 seconds. Then, send me the exact timestamp and the window location. Don't go near that building. I'm not going near that building, Emma said. I mean it. Rask, I'm a nurse. I'm standing outside a hospital. She looked at the satellite trucks across the street. I'm not going anywhere. She heard him moving, heard him speaking to someone in the background. Merritt, she thought. The tone was right. And then he came back. We're pulling the City Records office camera feed now. Stay available. She stayed available. She went back inside because the night air had gone cold and because standing on the sidewalk with her phone was not a useful thing to be doing. She got coffee from the break room, fresh coffee, someone had made a new pot, and she sat at the station and did the administrative work that accumulated during any shift like sediment, and she waited. The call came 40 minutes later. Not Rask. Merritt. The building wasn't empty, he said. Security camera shows Hayes and the logistics director. His name is Farrell. We've had him flagged since yesterday, entering through a side access at 5:31 p.m. They were in the building for 52 minutes. When our people arrived at 8:15, the building was empty again. A pause. But they left something. Emma was quiet. A server, Merritt said. Small, portable, the kind you use for off-site backup. It was plugged into the City Records office network, which connects to SPD's secondary administrative system through a shared infrastructure agreement. Another pause. Someone was trying to pull files before the investigation locked them down. Specifically, they were targeting 14 months of SPD dispatch logs. Emma thought about that. Dispatch logs would show every call to Northbridge Regional over 14 months, every time SPD had been notified of an unnamed patient, every timestamp that could connect Hayes' department to Pemberton's access logs. They were trying to delete the evidence of their own coordination, she said. They were trying to delete the paper trail that connects Hayes directly to the notification system, Merritt said. The logs would show that Hayes received dispatch alerts every time a flagged patient arrived. Not just Doyle, all 8. A pause. He knew. He wasn't just a tool who was used occasionally. He was a consistent participant. Emma set down her coffee. Did they get the files? No. The server had been running for approximately 11 minutes when our people arrived. The transfer was incomplete. He paused. And the city's IT infrastructure logs every access attempt. The incomplete transfer is, if anything, more useful than a clean deletion would have been. It shows exactly what they were trying to remove and why. She thought about Hayes at the ambulance bay, looking back into the ER. The face of someone calculating. He'd spent his career being the person who could make things disappear. Complaints, incidents, inconvenient records. And he'd walked into yesterday morning with the same assumption, that he was the one with the reach and the leverage and the ability to manage outcomes. He'd been wrong about that for at least 14 months. He'd just never been shown the evidence of it, until now. Merritt, Emma said. Is it enough? It was already enough, he said. This is just the part where they prove they knew it. Hayes was arrested at 11:40 p.m. at his home in the Crestfield district of Stonehaven. Emma was not there and did not see it happen. She was finishing her shift, writing her last set of notes, watching Darlene hand off to the night charge with the particular efficiency of someone who has kept everything running through a day that had no business being as manageable as it was. She found out from a text from Rask, 3 words, no punctuation, Hayes in custody, and she read it twice and then set her phone face down on the desk and finished her notes. Farrell was arrested within the hour at a hotel near the interstate, which suggested he'd been planning to leave Stonehaven and had not left quickly enough. She drove home slowly. The city at midnight was quiet in the way cities are when the infrastructure is still running. Lights, signals, the occasional truck. But the people have pulled back. She drove past the city records office without meaning to, just the route she'd taken, and she looked at the building as she passed. 3rd floor, the window Rask had flagged. Dark now. She parked and went upstairs and sat at her kitchen table with the same glass of water from the morning, which she'd left there, and she thought about Marcus Osei. She didn't know anything about him beyond what Pritchard and Noor had told her. DIA courier, unnamed in his chart, dead 14 months ago in a bay at a hospital that should have protected him. She didn't know if he'd had family beyond the sister in Trenton. She didn't know what he'd been carrying or where he'd been going or what his face looked like outside the context of a medical record that had documented his death inaccurately. She knew his name. She was going to make sure other people knew it too. She fell asleep at the table again and woke up at 6 a.m. feeling the specific wrongness of a neck that has been at the wrong angle for hours. And she made real coffee, and she called Merritt before 7. Osei's sister, she said. Has anyone contacted her? It's on the list, Merritt said. Move it up the list. A pause. Emma. He died in an ER. Someone told his next of kin what the chart said, which wasn't accurate. She deserves to know the real version before this is all over the news and she finds out from a headline. Emma was quiet for a moment. He was someone's brother. That doesn't get lost in the investigation. Another pause, shorter. I'll make it today, Merritt said. Thank you. The Northbridge Regional Hospital Board issued a formal public statement at 9 a.m. the following morning. Emma read it on her phone standing in her kitchen. It was 4 paragraphs long, and it covered the suspension of administrative personnel, the cooperation with federal investigators, and the hospital's commitment to patient care standards. The 4th paragraph was the one that mattered. It stated, without qualification, that Nurse Emma Carter had acted in full accordance with clinical protocol and professional ethics during the events of the preceding days, that her decisions had preserved the life of a critically injured patient, that the interference she had experienced from both internal administration and external law enforcement personnel had been inappropriate, unauthorized, and contrary to the hospital's standards, that the hospital unreservedly apologized for the conditions that had allowed that interference to occur. It did not use the word sorry, which Emma noticed and which she suspected had been a legal decision, but it said what it needed to say, and it said it in a public document that would be on record, and that was the part that mattered. Aldridge called her directly at 9:15. I wanted you to hear from me directly rather than from the statement, she said. What happened in this hospital was not acceptable. The systems that allowed it were not acceptable. I want you to know that the board's position on your conduct is not contingent on any outcome of any investigation. It stands independently, based on the footage and the clinical record. Emma stood at her window. I appreciate that, she said. You'll be receiving a formal invitation to return to the department in whatever capacity you choose. Full status, no conditions. A pause. I'd also like to discuss something else with you when you're ready, but that can wait. What is it? We're being required by the state to implement a new oversight structure for patient identification protocols. We need someone to lead the design of that structure, someone with clinical judgment, not administrative instinct. Another pause. I thought you might have opinions about what it should look like. Emma thought about the gap between what the system was designed to do and what it had actually done. The 14 months in which unnamed patients had moved through this hospital with no one at the administrative level looking out for them rather than looking at them. I have opinions, she said. Good, Aldridge said. So do I. We'll find a time. The formal proceedings moved at the pace formal proceedings move, which is slower than anyone wants but faster than it could be when the evidence is as complete as it was. Pemberton was charged with obstruction of a federal investigation, abuse of administrative access, and Chfol, once the forensic medical review of Osei's and the second patient's deaths was completed. Conspiracy to interfere with emergency medical care, resulting in death. The forensic review took 6 weeks, and its conclusions were not ambiguous. In both cases, the patient's care had been interrupted at a critical window, and the interruption had been material to the outcome. The language of the report was clinical and precise and devastating. Hayes was charged with abuse of authority, obstruction of emergency medical care, interference with a federal investigation, and the charge that the union had been calling impossible since the day of his arrest, conspiracy in connection with the monitoring network. The dispatch logs, incomplete transfer and all, provided the time-stamped record of 14 months of coordination. His defense argued that he'd believed the notifications were legitimate law enforcement intelligence. The dispatch logs argued otherwise, with the particular eloquence of contemporaneous records that nobody had expected to survive. Farrell, the logistics director, cooperated. He'd made that decision apparently within hours of his arrest, and his cooperation opened the shape of the contractor network, who had commissioned the monitoring, who had received the intelligence, what it had been used for. That investigation extended well beyond Stonehaven and well beyond Northbridge Regional, and Emma followed the public-facing developments without trying to chase the parts that weren't public, because it wasn't her investigation and she had work. Fortis, the board member, resigned and retained his own legal counsel and spent the next several months in the specific purgatory of people who knew enough to be implicated, but not enough to be essential witnesses. He was eventually fined and barred from serving on hospital boards in the state. Emma wasn't satisfied by that outcome exactly, but she understood that it was the outcome the evidence supported, and she'd been a nurse long enough to know that what you get is not always what the severity of the situation deserves. Noor, Dr. Sylvia Noor, faced a state medical board review for the inaccurate documentation in Osei's chart. Emma appeared before the board as a character witness, not because she'd been asked to, but because she'd decided that Noor's decision to walk into Northbridge Regional and tell the truth, after 11 months of carrying it alone, was the kind of decision that deserved to be visible. The board issued a formal reprimand and a requirement for additional ethics training, no suspension. Noor had called Emma afterward, and the conversation had been short and not quite comfortable, but it had ended with Noor saying, "I'm going back to emergency medicine," and Emma saying, "Good," and both of them meaning it. Osei's sister was named Vivian. She lived in Trenton, worked as a school administrator, and had been told 14 months ago that her brother had died of traumatic cardiac arrest following a gunshot wound sustained in circumstances that were under police investigation. She had accepted that because there was nothing else to accept, and she had been left with the ordinary brutal grief of losing someone suddenly. Merritt called her the morning after Emma had asked him to. He told Emma, later, that the call had taken 40 minutes, and that he'd stayed on the line until Vivian was ready for him to go. The real version wasn't easier than the chart version in some ways, but it was true, and it included the information that the people responsible for what had happened to her brother were facing criminal charges, and that his name was part of the official record now. Not as an unnamed patient, not as a John Doe, but as Marcus Osei, DYA courier, a man who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time in a hospital that should have been a place of safety. Emma found out from Merritt that Vivian had asked, specifically, for the name of the nurse who had been in the bay during Doyle's treatment, who had refused to step back, who had held the line. She'd wanted to know if the same thing could have happened to Marcus if a different person had been on shift that day. Merritt had told her, probably not. Not that day, with that nurse. Vivian had said, I want her to know that matters. Merritt had passed it along. Emma had received it the way she received most things, quietly, in private, with the knowledge that it was true, and the understanding that true things don't always make the arithmetic easier. Okay. The months that followed had the quality of things that are important but not dramatic. The daily accumulation of change rather than the single rupture of crisis. Emma went back to the ER. She did her job. She was the same nurse she had been before, which meant imperfect, overextended, occasionally short-tempered with systems that didn't work, occasionally too direct with patients who needed softness more than efficiency. She forgot to eat lunch more days than she didn't. She still drove to work rather than walking when the weather was bad, even though the walk was manageable because some mornings the extra 10 minutes in the car was the only quiet she was going to get. The oversight structure Aldridge had asked her about became, over 3 months of working groups and arguments and 2 complete rebuilds, a formal patient advocacy protocol for unidentified patients, a system that logged access, required dual authorization for any administrative contact with unnamed patient records, and created a mandatory escalation path if that authorization was questioned. Emma wrote most of the clinical components herself, in the evenings, at her kitchen table, and she fought over the administrative components with 2 board members and an outside consultant, and Darlene, who had opinions about everything and was usually right. It was not a perfect system. She'd said so when presenting it to the board. No system was perfect, and any system that relied entirely on process rather than on people willing to stand in the gap when the process failed was a system that would eventually fail. What she'd built was the best available approximation of accountability, and the people running it would have to carry the rest. The board had approved it. Aldridge had shaken Emma's hand afterward, which was a formal gesture that felt genuine and which Emma had accepted without making it awkward. In the spring, 7 months after the morning with the helicopters, the Department of Defense held a small ceremony. Not public, deliberately small, a conference room at a federal building in the city, 12 people present. Rask was there. Merritt, 2 representatives from the DIA Doyle, walking without a cane for the first time in 4 months and looking like himself or like the version of himself that had come out the other side of a thing. Emma wore her civilian clothes. She hadn't been sure what else to wear and had decided that the attempt to dress for an occasion she didn't fully understand the shape of would be worse than showing up as herself. A woman in civilian dress, introduced only as from the office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, presented Emma with a classified commendation. The language was formal and specific and described, in the careful vocabulary of government documents, what she had done in Bay 3 on the morning in question. The clinical actions, the refusal to step back, the protection of the patient, and incidentally, of the intelligence architecture he was carrying. The woman said, "On behalf of the department, we want to acknowledge that the kind of courage you demonstrated doesn't require uniform." Emma looked at the commendation in her hands. It was a piece of paper in a folder, and it documented something that had happened in 43 minutes in an emergency department in Stonehaven, and it would go into a file marked classified, and most of it would never be public. She was fine with that. "I want to say something," she said, to the room. The woman nodded. "Marcus Osei should be in this room," Emma said. "Not me, or not only me." She looked at the commendation. "Whatever this is for, part of it is for him, for the fact that nobody was in his bay doing what I did in Doyle's. I want that acknowledged somewhere." A silence. Then Rask said, "It's acknowledged." "In writing," Emma said. Another pause. Then the woman from the office said, "We'll make sure of it." Emma nodded. She sat down. Doyle caught her eye from across the room. He raised his chin slightly, a small, precise acknowledgement. She nodded back. The verdicts came in over the following months, staggered, the legal system processing each case at its own pace. Pemberton. Guilty on all counts. The conspiracy charge carried the most weight, and the judge's sentencing remarks were, by the account of the reporters who covered the hearing, unusually direct, describing the abuse of an institution of care as an offense of a particular severity, one that required an answer commensurate with the trust that had been violated. He received 8 years. His medical license and the licenses of the 2 administrators who'd been closest to the network were revoked permanently. The contracting firm was dissolved. The contractor whose financial interests had initiated the monitoring network was the subject of a separate federal prosecution that was still moving through the system when everything else had resolved, which was the way of things. The largest targets took the longest to process, and Emma had learned not to wait for complete resolution before deciding that enough had happened to call it justice. Hayes. Guilty on 4 counts. The conspiracy charge had been reduced through his cooperation, a development Emma had not enjoyed but which Merritt had explained as necessary for the completeness of the broader case, and she had accepted that explanation without liking it. He was sentenced to 4 years and stripped of his badge and pension. He would not work in law enforcement again. The union released a statement that said nothing of substance and was ignored by everyone. The Stonehaven Courier ran the verdicts on the front page, with a photograph of the exterior of Northbridge Regional that Emma found, in retrospect, apt. The building itself, the entrance, not a person. The building had been both the site of the failure and the site of the resistance to it, and that ambiguity seemed accurate. She didn't read the article all the way through. It was a Tuesday in late spring when a new nursing student showed up in the ER for her first clinical rotation. Her name was Paige. She was 22, visibly nervous, and had made the mistake of arriving 10 minutes early, which meant she was standing at the entrance when Emma came in, and Emma had to decide in the first 30 seconds how to calibrate the tone of whatever came next. She'd been given oversight of the student rotation as part of her expanded role, which she'd accepted because Darlene had told her to, and because, underneath her reluctance, she understood why it mattered. "Carter?" the student said. She had a tablet and a lanyard, and the look of someone who had prepared extensively. "That's me," Emma said. "You're Paige?" "Yes, I've read about what happened here. Last fall with the—" "You're going to read a lot of things about a lot of hospitals," Emma said, "and most of them will be less useful than what you learn in the first week of a real shift." She pushed through the ER doors. "Come in." Paige followed. They were 40 minutes into the morning when Paige made her first mistake, a charting error, minor, the kind that new nurses make when they're managing 3 things simultaneously and their documentation hand is running slightly behind their clinical hand. Emma caught it, corrected it, explained why it mattered without making it more significant than it was. Paige said quietly, "I'm sorry. I was flustered." "Flustered is fine," Emma said. "Flustered and accurate is the goal. Work on the accurate part first, the calm will follow." She paused. "It takes longer than anyone tells you." Paige looked at her. "Did it take you a long time?" Emma thought about that honestly, the way she'd been trying to do things since last fall, with less protective editing, more accuracy, the same discipline she applied to clinical documentation. "The calm part?" "Yeah," she said. "Still working on it, some days." Paige nodded, like that was the most useful thing anyone had told her. They went back to work. 3 weeks later, standing outside the renovated emergency entrance, fresh paint on the external walls, new signage, the small physical evidence of an institution trying to be different from what it had been, Emma ran into Darlene leaving a late shift. They stood for a moment in the evening air, the way coworkers do when neither one is in a hurry, and there's nothing specific to say, but the company is easy. "Paige is getting better," Darlene said. "She is." "She asked me yesterday if you were always this direct." Emma looked at her. "What did you say?" "I said you were more direct after last fall than before, but that it was an improvement." Darlene's mouth did the thing it did when she was being dry. "I may have said it charitably." Emma almost laughed. "That's charitable." Darlene looked at the entrance. "You know what I keep thinking about? When Aldridge asked you to design the oversight protocol, You spent 3 months fighting with everyone over it. I spent 3 months being right, Emma said. You were right. Darlene paused. But you were also impossible. I know. They stood there for another moment. You going to stay? Darlene asked. Not the hospital. She meant something larger, a choice being made continuously rather than once. Emma looked at the entrance. She thought about the answer she could give and the answer that was true, and like most of the time, those were the same thing now. I'm going to stay, she said. She didn't explain why. Darlene didn't ask. Some things are clear enough that the language around them would only make them smaller. She walked back through the entrance, past the new signage, into the ER where a shift was running and patients were waiting and the work continued without pause because it always did. She put on her gloves. She had learned over a year of being seen by the wrong people for the wrong reasons, and then the right people for the right ones, that recognition was not the point. Recognition was what happened when the work was done honestly for long enough that it became impossible to ignore. It was not the goal. The goal was the work. The goal was the patient in front of you, the chart in your hand, the decision that had to be made correctly because someone's life was the consequence of getting it wrong. She'd known that before last fall. She just knew it differently now, with the specific weight of everything she'd been asked to put down and had refused to put down, and everything she'd carried through it, and the understanding that the quiet kind of strength is not quiet because it has nothing to say, but because it has learned where its voice is most useful. She picked up the first chart of the shift. She got to work.